Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those who are joining in for the first time, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Our guest today is Behnam Taleblu. He's a senior fellow at FDD, where he's involved with the Iran program, the Center on Economic and Financial Power, and the Center on Military and Political Power. We are here today to discuss the recent developments involving and revolving around the Vienna talks, the negotiations about the new nuclear deal between US, Russia, China, European states, and Iran. As we are seeing, the talks keep running into unexpected or expected obstacles, primarily driven by Iran's continuous demands and rejections of various concessions by the United States. How Iran got to the place to dictate the US how these negotiations should run is precisely the point of this conversation. And Behnam, I would love to hear your perspective on this. How is it that an economically weak power that's known for its terrorism, that has been on the verge of collapse, is in a position to drive these negotiations from a position of strength?
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, and greetings to the online audience and those watching. I think in this sense, it may be best to quote back to you the comments which aired on a Iranian state television documentary of the commander of Iran's aerospace force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The aerospace force is basically the entity of the IRGC that has operational control over Iran's ballistic missiles, which multiple US government assessments have said is the largest in the region. This IRGC officer, Amir Ali Hajizadeh is his name, essentially said in the aftermath of Iran's response to the killing of Soleimani, where Iran itself launched 16 short-range ballistic missiles at least two different sites in Iraq, which constituted the largest ever attack American forces have faced from ballistic missiles. He basically talked about Iran's cognizance of its weakness, but I'm paraphrasing him now. He talked about matching that lack of material capability that you mentioned right now, with its reference to it being a terrorism sponsoring state, implicitly being conventionally weak. But matching that with will or greater resolve to act with those limited capabilities. And Iran's engagement of the US directly, publicly, using attributable weapons of war fired from its own territory really enshrines the predicament we're in now quite well, in my view, which is that here you have a state economically tier 3, tier 4, but has a great will, has a great risk tolerance, has a great appetite for conflict. They're not suicidal in that sense, but they are quite willing to push every single red line imposed on them. And they're constantly drawing inferences about resolve, about staying power, about capability, about alliances, about partnerships that are designed to counter them, whether they're economic or political or technical or military. And in this sense, as you mentioned, a country with some of the overtly limited capabilities has been able to not only drive nuclear negotiations, but has been actually somewhat successful in landing blows against many of its regional adversaries which are key US partners and allies, such as Israel, such as Saudi Arabia, such as some of the other Gulf Cooperation Council states like the UAE or Bahrain, even, which we shouldn't forget about. And ultimately, somewhat successful in inching along one of the larger long-term goals of the Islamic Republic, which is to evict America from the Persian Gulf and greater Middle East. And while admittedly it itself is not in the driver's seat of that debate, it is in a key position to take advantage of certain debates in Washington about retrenchment or isolationism versus internationalism or deeper engagement. So in this sense, the Islamic Republic has significant will, has significant risk tolerance, and is willing to use that combination in conjunction with its limited but evolving material and missile and military capabilities to leverage the threats that it's already able to produce at home to get what it wants. And that's true for the region, and that's especially true for the framework that you asked about, which is the nuclear negotiating table. I'm happy in some kind of follow-up to get to the economics of that equation. I'm happy to get to Iranian strategy, both against maximum pressure from former President Trump and what you may or may not be able to call maximum deference, as some of my colleagues have called the policy of Trump's replacement, President Joe Biden, which has partaken essentially in 11 months of indirect nuclear diplomacy with the then outgoing Rouhani administration and then the new incoming and now present Raisi administration in Iran.
Now, before we get into the heart of that question that you just raised, you brought up a very interesting point. You said that Iran is looking to take advantage of discussions and debates in Washington. Now, we have seen how it's one of its partners, one of its allies, Russia, has been taking advantage of some of these debates and fueling propaganda campaigns that actually exacerbated the polarization and exacerbated the isolationist sentiment and other concerns in the US. Do you think Iran is employing the same methods to enhance its information warfare advantage among both the policy makers and debaters and the public, or do you think this is just a general natural sentiment and has nothing to do with Iran?
Well, it may be both. It's going to be qualitatively and quantitatively, but more importantly, empirically challenging to say it's only one or only the other. And in my view, it's both. And I say both because there is data to support both. In some weird way, despite working on the Iran issue in DC for a while, I end up knowing a lot more about the way the regime, based on its very public debates, which are adjudicated even on state television in Iran, through the semi-official and official media in Iran, through the social media space in Iran. I'm a better follower of their debates about us than our debates about them here. That's just, par for the course, the nature of the job. I follow the way the regime and some of their elites inside Iran frame and talk about this. So sometimes you end up learning about how they're talking about American talking points by virtue of discovering it or coming across it in their official narrative. And I'll give you, one very broad example, again, because I don't want to get too much into the specifics of this, because I think Russia may simply be a more sophisticated actor, both in the cyberspace and in the information space, but that is not to downplay Iran's evolution in this space or entry into this space. And what I mean by that is maybe a little over a decade ago, you could see the very generic, very crass, very hyperbolic, very gross, literally gross descriptions of the American left and the American right and being pro-Israel in Washington by regime elites in Iran. They would paint all of Washington with one broad brush, say it's a Zionist-controlled foreign policy of America. It was very gross, broad, generic statements that don't seem to understand the gradations of the debate in Washington or within the American body politic. But one thing I want to stress for the audience is the nature of the JCPOA debate, the rancorous nature, the partisan nature, the consensus-shattering nature of the JCPOA in 2015 and into the present, which, as you see, has made Iran somewhat more of a partisan issue on Capitol Hill today than prior to 2015. It was a very public debate. And the Iranians, by virtue of direct negotiations between the 2013 and 2015 period that yielded the JCPOA, got exposure to a certain flank of American politics, to a certain flank of American society. Iran's then Foreign Minister Javad Zarif speaking at the Asia Society, speaking at Council on Foreign Relations in New York, traveling, meeting with journalists. Exposure gives you information, and sustained contacts give you sustained impressions about a certain flank of American politics and American society. And all of this is to say that I think the regime understands the debate now between isolationism and internationalism, between the left and the right, between Republican and Democrat. And I'm not saying that those labels neatly match those, because sometimes the debate is more of a circle than a straight line between those two different flanks in Washington. But the regime understands our partisan domestic politics today, they understand how countering Iran can be viewed through those lenses that I mentioned, just as countering Russia can be viewed through those lenses that I mentioned. And so suffice to say, to talk about, one unique way I discovered it among many, and I don't want to bore your audience with it, is that there was I think a large 70-some page document last year that the Iranian Foreign Ministry gave to their parliament. And it was their assessment of the JCPOA resurrection negotiations of 2021 from April to June of 2021. This was the outgoing Rouhani administration. And in it, there was even an assessment of to how the Iranians saw the Democratic Party, foreign policy, and the linkage of that with the JCPOA. It was not a sophisticated analysis, but it was an analysis nonetheless that realized how the Iran issue had become a partisan issue. You also see this, for instance, with the way that the US government talked about not just Iran, but also Russia's hacking for the 2020 election, their understanding of left, right, foreign policy agenda items that were pushed by Trump and comparatively pushed by Trump's opponents, and how to touch on domestic debates that might have second, third order effects. You don't have to take my word for it. And again, I'm not the person studying how it touches the US debate as well, but you can take Facebook or Microsoft, if I'm not mistaken. It was a large tech company's word for it in 2018 and 2019 when they talked about Iranian disinformation operations on social media, basically pushing narratives that had a particular political bent. And it's totally fine for any American to have, it's a free society, free country, to have any of this bent, but the way that in which the Iranians were trying to take advantage of that space. And moving forward, and to tie it into the other actor you mentioned, which is Russia, a fear I have, which people of a somewhat more nonpartisan disposition may have, but really any American can have if you look at our debate, is how America's authoritarian adversaries are going to be able to capitalize on the nature of our more open, but also more vitriolic debates about about American foreign policy in the 21st century. And again, given the country you mentioned, Russia, you really aptly see this with the Ukraine war debates, particularly the Americans who project something of a cultural lens onto it. That the Atlanticists versus the isolationists. There's a rich debate there. But all of this is good detail to say that I think Iran is in the space, but there's tons of Americans who endogenously and sui generis may believe it as well. But I certainly think that Russia is a more sophisticated actor. And that's not me as a Russia analyst saying it, it's just me as an Iran analyst saying it and looking where Iran, you can at least measure relative to an actor like Russia or even China, can be active in that space. But again, my focus is more on the way Tehran sees Washington and Washington sees Tehran.
Well, speaking of Washington seeing Tehran, you earlier mentioned the maximum deference policy, which raises a lot of questions about Washington's perception of Iran as a power projecting player. We are also increasingly seeing some pushback from Congress to the Biden's administration apparent adaptation of that maximum deference policy, but so far it has not yielded concrete results. So what can you tell us about this? Why has this administration adopted this approach, especially after the mistakes that we have seen with JCPOA and after the diplomatic engagement and the lessons learned about Iran's diplomatic negotiation style and their strengths and weaknesses?
I think it's a very good question. I mean, part of it gets to, this is certainly not the right word and certainly not the right word in this environment, but part of it gets to the Kremlinology of the individuals in the Biden administration. What did they believe? What did they believe before they got to, this position? And how are they acting based on those beliefs throughout their position in power? Part of it is that. And part of it is, again, this increasingly partisan debate about Iran that we are seeing. And to zoom out for a little bit of context for the audience, in the post-Cold War period, it has quite been a trend to look at the way candidates for the position of president have campaigned looking to use foreign policy to draw a stark contrast to the person they're trying to beat or replace. One example is Clinton being much more internationalist than H.W. Bush, who was a realist, although he talked about New World Order and all of this stuff and the liberation of Kuwait. There's a sharp contrast between the campaign rhetoric of Clinton and liberal internationalism versus H.W. Bush at the tail end of the Cold War. Then you can contrast that to George W. Bush in the campaign in 2000 versus Clinton's internationalism. Everyone may remember the line in the campaign against Al Gore when then candidate George Bush talked about a more humble foreign policy. And then 9/11 changed that, and there was a major overcorrection. And Obama's outreach to Iran, tour throughout the Middle East was essentially his overcorrection of Bush's correction and the pulling back of the support for democratization and nation building in the Middle East. And in many ways, the Trump campaign and later Trump presidency reversed much of the foreign policy achievements, quote unquote, of the Obama era, one of which was the JCPOA, another of which was, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, if I'm not mistaken, another which was the Paris Climate Accord. So the politicization of the foreign policy gains and the foreign policy legacy is quite clear in American politics in the post-Cold War era. And the Iran debate, to the best of my knowledge, and from this perch here, certainly has not been immune to that. So getting to Joe Biden, the Biden campaign campaigned against the approach of the Trump administration, which was to withdraw from the JCPOA. And for increasingly political reasons, in my view, in 2020, talked about JCPOA reentry. And it admitted that there were flaws in the deal. It admitted that there were things that the administration, that America should be doing that went beyond the JCPOA, such as the need to counter Iran on the missile front, on the terrorism front, stand up for human rights more. But it simply saw the JCPOA as the predicate to build this policy. And in my view, an agreement that gives millions to the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, handcuffs America's peaceful tools of punishment, deterrence, and coercion, will not be able to successfully change the behavior or even change the minds of those hardened men like Amir Ali Hajizadeh, who I led with earlier in our conversation today, about American resolve and about American staying power, if that is being traded away for a lopsided deal. Because even if we take the Biden campaign and now Biden administration at its word that the baseline approach to Iran needs to be capping the nuclear threat, paying for a somewhat larger breakout timeline, paying for less time on the clock that existed in 2015, and then trying to build a commensurate counter-Iran policy, either through regional partners or through the US itself. After that, it remains, how are you going to do that if you take those most powerful peaceful weapons like the US sanctions off the table? And this is where we get to the identity, because many of the individuals were simply pro-deal and anti-sanctions, to the best of my knowledge, as somewhat of a disposition or an orientation. It seemed to be a little bit more dogma than political analysis. And this is not a partisan criticism. There's people on the right that may have the inverse of this, where it may be political dogma rather than analysis. But these are the views of individuals, and you respect them. And there's an old saying in Washington, which is, goodness, what is the saying? It's about personnel being policy. Personnel is policy. So in this sense, the deferential policy, the view that the reason we were at the current impasse with Iran in 2020 it was the fault of America, was the fault of leaving the deal, was the fault of US sanctions, manifested itself early on in the Biden administration. And you saw things like the unilateral revocation of the Houthi designation. The Houthis are the rebels in Yemen, which for almost 7 years now, or if not exactly 7 years now, have been fighting, besieging in Yemen, have ousted the legitimate government, and have been, basically using everything from child soldiers to a whole host of projectiles that the Islamic Republic has provided it with, to include drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, and precision-guided munitions to strike a whole host of targets in Yemen that its adversaries control, as well as its civilian targets in Saudi Arabia and more increasingly in the United Arab Emirates. So the unilateral revocation of this, in my view, is a gift to Iran, is a sweetener to Iran, something the Biden administration thought would help its negotiations. And the view then was to give things to Iran that would be sweeteners that would incentivize it to come to the table early, to resurrect the JCPOA early. But in my view, the administration did not draw on the lessons of history, which is usually when you give an incentive to the Islamic Republic, they pocket the concession unilaterally and then ask for more. In many ways, that was a big learning curve for the Obama negotiating team from 2013 to 2015. And even deal proponents like Wendy Sherman, reported this both on Twitter as well as in her memoirs of her time in the State Department. And she is now back at the helm in the State Department. So you can see the one-to-one there. Lastly, this is a point I want to stress on the sanctions front. The Biden administration, I think, tried to have its cake and eat it too on sanctions, and it led to where we are today, in the sense that the administration knew that there was a left side and a right side of the debate, that the right side would want to keep the existing Trump-era sanctions, enforce them, and build on them, and then the left side would want to begin to unilaterally revoke the Trump-era sanctions and find a way to have a U.S. policy that is consistent with the JCPOA and in effect unilaterally disarm America. The Biden approach was to keep the Trump-era sanctions on the books legally. It did not go about removing a whole host of penalties. Probably the clearest penalty that it did remove was the Houthi FTO, for instance. But what it did with the big oil sanctions, the banking sanctions, the financial sanctions, some of the other associated ones like the storage of oil or targeting of increased non-oil sales to the region, for instance, which is a big way the regime did bust sanctions in the more recent period. What it did was it turned a blind eye to the active enforcement. And it continued providing waivers for things like Iranian energy exports to Iraq. It became increasingly more permissive with things like Iran's frozen assets in South Korea, and in a sense, very slowly began to go after, very, very slowly began to use tools available to it through the Treasury Department to go after Iran's non-nuclear threats, having one slate of drone designations in the fall of 2021, one slate of human rights designations late in 2021, and then ultimately throughout the summer, talking about the prospect of oil enforcement, but only once or twice going after those illicit ship-to-ship transfers and transfers to producers. The administration didn't even name China. It simply said to importers in East Asia, if I'm not mistaken. So it tried to give a bone to the left by saying, it's not, or by hinting through its behavior that it's not enforcing sanctions, and a bone to the right by saying, look, the sanctions remain on the books. But in between this debate and this posture, I think the Iranians were able to capitalize by continuing to pocket the concessions of maximum deference and ask for more, as you mentioned, which is how talks went from the Rouhani government to the Raisi government, and how Iran avoided, on all four occasions available to America, a resolution of censure, which is the minimum diplomatic sign you can take from Washington that it is interested in pushing back on Iran and holding its feet to the fire and making it be accountable to much more important non-proliferation agreements than the JCPOA. And in this sense, Iran saw the hesitancy of the Biden administration to enforce sanctions. It saw a political desire by Biden for a deal, which exceeded Iran's economic needs for a deal. And through this sense, plus, of course, many other regional factors, the US botched withdrawal, and that's to put it politely, from Afghanistan, the diminishing force posture in the region, the strategic unpreparedness for the concurrent threats of Russia, China, North Korea, and you really get to where we are today with the current impasse with Iran. And I apologize, that was very lengthy, but there was a lot of context to explain.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a mystery to be unraveled here, which is the fact that JCPOA had several key flaws that would make it unacceptable upon closer to examination in that form, which is, first of all, the fact that quote-unquote deal was never actually signed, and it was more over one unilateral US policy than a real agreement. It was not a treaty. It was not signed by Iran. And the second issue was that this unilateral policy, which Iran claimed to be holding up on its own end. From the very beginning, we've seen evidence of its cheating and continuing with its nuclear proliferation schemes, which alone made it clear that the policy was unilateral on the US end and it was not actually ideal, so to speak. A couple of these key points have transferred over to the current set of negotiations, and the fact of the matter is, as most analysts concur, it's very unlikely in the current form that the Biden administration is proposing to 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 gain approval from Congress. At best, it's going to be another short-lived unilateral policy which will end disastrously. But the key point that seems to be missing from these discussions is the fact that most Americans, however isolationist, are probably not a fan of unilateral policies where the other side is cheating and US is not gaining much or actually losing. So how does the Biden administration and all the actors that you've mentioned, especially the ones that should have known better after the first time go around but didn't, how do they justify this current proceedings that are very unlikely to yield positive results and are increasingly unpopular with Americans of all backgrounds?
So before I get into how I think the Biden administration is selling it or justifying it, I should say, I want to make one thing clear, which is sometimes lost in the debate over the JCPOA. And I promise it's not the sunsets, it's not the timelines, it's not something I over focus on here in Washington, which is the evolving missile issue. It's something even more fundamental that when you use the word flaw or when you use the word issue, and you painted a picture of some of the shortcomings of the deal. I want to respectfully add this one, and both you and I, I'm sure, agree that there are many of those flaws and shortcomings. But in some ways, this wasn't even presented when the Trump administration presented its critique of the deal to the Europeans in 2017, 2018. And they had agreed upon this troika of areas to improve, which was one, I believe, was monitoring, IEA verification monitoring. The second was the delivery vehicle, ballistic missiles. Those need to be controlled and regulated. And then, of course, the third was the sunset clauses needed to be extended or removed entirely. So basically making it a permanent deal or a much longer deal, dealing with the delivery vehicle for WMD, and ultimately improving access and monitoring verification. But even this troika does not adequately paint a picture, in my view, of the most fundamental flaw, which is that you have a major concession that is what allowed for the JCPOA. And we have to be honest about this. And the major concession is that the United States had a policy that had managed to enshrine under both Democratic and Republican presidents that back-ended a much larger consensus position among Democratic and Republican presidents that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. And that minor consensus within that was that Iran should not be permitted to engage in the domestic enrichment of uranium on its own soil. Given its track record, given illicit procurement in the 80s and 90s, given undeclared sites, material facilities, given the poor IEA-Iran relationship at that time, given all of these factors, it was kind of an article of faith in higher up US policy circles in the early 2000s, up until really much of the early Obama administration as well, that Iran should not be permitted domestic enrichment. And the change in US policy under Obama is what allowed for the JPOA in 2013 and JCPOA in 2015. And that was a framing change, which is not can Iran enrich uranium domestically, yes or no, or should Iran enrich uranium domestically, yes or no, but it's how much uranium can Iran be permitted to enrich and stockpile. And when you actually have this activity, absent the proper safeguards, absent the proper enforcement, absent the proper blueprint and baseline to know where to inspect and know where to look and know what verification actively means, you have the potential for diversion. You have the potential for a secret site. You have the potential for a secret facility. And you have, as you've had in the past, a civilian cover and a military core for a nuclear program. And ultimately, permitting Iran the right to domestic enrichment is in many ways the original sin of the JCPOA. It's the original sin of the JPOA. And it will be the original sin of whatever agreement is agreed to that's likely a lesser version of those agreements. As long as you have the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, which has had every single declared and overt site be, as it was in the past, an undeclared and secret site, and you do not have a full IEA accounting, you do not have a broader conclusion, you do not have a proper baseline for verification, you do not have the regime living up to more important agreements it signed, like the NPT, like the additional protocol, like its comprehensive safeguard agreement. As long as you don't have that architecture and you have domestic enrichment, you have the threat of this diversion, or you have the threat of this secret breakout kind of a program potential from Iran's nuclear program. And as long as you can't verify it's purely civilian use, in my view, prudence dictates that you don't grant this kind of capability. The US ultimately granted this kind of capability, and the Iranians understand that, which is why they're fighting so hard for agreements that retain that right. Agreements like the JPOA, the JCPOA, and whatever this potentially future deal will have. All of them reverse more than decades of US policy towards Iran, and they reversed the international consensus from 2006 to 2010 in at least 5 UN Security Council resolutions on Iran, sanctioning Iran for this sort of enrichment activity and calling for a full cessation. So this is really the original sin, and incorporating this original sin in a future deal is again sowing the seeds for the demise of that deal. And in my view, this is the definition of folly, or with respect, stupidity. So that's that. The larger point to your original question about how they're justifying it, I think the administration is trying to draw on some of those sentiments you discussed. Perhaps isolationism may not be the right word, but Americans being tired of the Middle East, Americans being tired of ending endless wars. We all remember Biden's speech prior to the withdrawal from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, framing that as a success, that he was ending an endless war. And then you zoom out a little bit further, you see that theme of ending an endless war. You see that theme of being tired with the Middle East evident in strains certainly of Trump's thinking and Trump's speaking, and certainly evident in strains of Obama's thinking and Obama's speaking, and the overcorrection to the early 2000s and to the Bush era and to the post 9/11 era that you saw in those more modern iterations of Democratic and Republican presidents. So Biden is the heir to those debates. And in many ways, he's taking those debates on steroids. And he's hoping to not have to pay a domestic price for those foreign policy failures of acting on those steroids, like the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, the initially slow response to Ukraine, basically having a policy of engagement only that the Kim dynasty laughed at in Pyongyang in North Korea. And certainly amid all of these different crises, trying to deter and counter a rising China, prevent a Taiwan invasion, and to deal with, the full investigation of the COVID crisis, the origins, as well as, of course, PLA military modernization in China, plus continued cyber espionage and everything else that we know is coming out of China today. So there's a lot on the foreign policy plate of the Biden administration. And they are trying to rank order these threats. And in my view, the way they're going to be justifying a lesser version of the JCPOA is that they will say that, and they were going to draw on, I think, the talking points of the previous Democratic administration, that it's this deal or war. So that's going to be the baseline. The second is what was reported in Axios early in January. And you could really see from all of 2021, in all honesty, that every possible opportunity presented to the administration to talk about the Iran nuclear deal and the Iran nuclear challenge will be an opportunity for the administration to claim, falsely in my view, that the deal was working and that Trump's walk out of the deal in 2018 is the gas on the fire that brought us to the current crisis, forsaking everything that you had said about those Iranian incremental violations, which became overt in 2019, but prior to 2018 and 2019, some of them were covert. There were multiple breaches of the heavy water caps in the deal. There were breaches of the centrifuge R&D plan in the deal. But I think most overtly prior to 2018, you had gross violations of Annex B of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. And this was a resolution that codified and enshrined the JCPOA. It was passed just days after the JCPOA, and it copy-pastes the full text of the JCPOA in this resolution. And Annex B has those prohibitions, which used to be permanent in those older UN Security Council resolutions, about prohibiting arms transfers to and from Iran, about prohibiting ballistic missile testing and other ballistic missile-related activity to Iran, subjugating them to a 5-year and an 8-year timeline, respectively. and then ultimately not even being to enforce when Iran would grossly violate those 5-year and those 8-year timelines by transferring weapons, as it did to Iraq, to the Assad regime, to Lebanese Hezbollah, and perhaps most overtly and dangerously, as we saw from 2015 to present, to the Houthis in Yemen, really underwriting their long-range strike capability. And then, of course, with their ballistic missile program on steroids since that period of time. But 2017 to present, the regime has taken off the mask and engaged in public and attributable ballistic missile operations from their own territory, kind of building on top of their proxy strategy and not masking their hand, but actually showing their hand and launching missiles publicly and saying it came from Iran, not being afraid of any kind of kinetic pushback. And so, given all of those violations, the administration has been willing to look the other way, make the claim that it's this deal or war, cite the issue of if there is a problem today, it's because Trump left in 2018, and then ultimately say that the deal caps the most urgent threat. Rather than deal with all the threats, it's going back to the older approach to Iran that existed under Bush and Obama, which is to treat nuclear as the most important and not integrate all the other threats into a larger basket. And to say that this deals with the nuclear threat, that prudence and good government and responsibility dictates that you can rank order threats and deal with them one at a time. So this is us dealing with them one at a time. And they would believe that the trade-off, the sanctions trade-off in their justification would be worth it to kick the can down the road, even for only a few more years. And then if someone like me or someone like you or anyone else might have an issue with this trade-off or would see it as unfair, they might say, well, Iran is not China. Iran is not Russia. Iran is not these other larger threats that we face. So we have to cap the threat to pivot and deal with these other threats. Totally, I think, reading the world wrong and, in my view, falsely thinking that those threats can be stovepiped. Today, Russia is very active in the Middle East. China, it's the second time Iran's foreign minister has gone to China in 3 months. The GCC countries, many of their foreign ministers went to China for a week in late January. The Chinese are looking to build off of the trade imbalance that used to exist with the US and now is existing with China for the GCC when it comes to energy sales and other kinds of business ties. And ultimately, these nations, Russia and China, are engaging in a different kind of predation in the Middle East. They're looking to talk to different states. They're looking to enmesh themselves economically, politically, and ultimately later on militarily in the region for the Chinese, and then inverse for the Russians, to make the claim that America is a waning power and we are not, and we can deal with everybody. So if the administration thinks that it can cap a threat, pay a high price for it, and pivot to deal with other threats, it is not only not going to have capped this threat, it's going to have underwritten the legal expansion of Iran's nuclear program in less time than the JCPOA permitted, but also it's going to fail to adequately address those near peer competitor or great power competition challenges, because no country in the world can go from losing a non-state actor war to going to fight a major adversary and think that there is not going to be some kind of trade-off or carryover there. So in many ways, I see this obsession with getting a mere cap on the JCPOA issue and pivoting as, again, the administration sowing the seeds of failure for the future.
Well, you've touched on many issues, but there's a couple that I think are worth underscoring. One, there's this perception of, which you mentioned, of a pivot to other threats, but it seems to me that these threats are being treated like as isolated entities. There is Iran, there is China, there's Russia, and they are all separate problematic actors. But in reality, they are not only do they pursue their own individual agendas that are separately harmful, but they also are allies. They form an axis, and they, I think it's a mistake not to believe that there is cooperation and coordination among them, including in response to any form of Western pressure on any one of them. North Korea, by the way, that you mentioned in passing, is also one of those actors. It's some believe it to be a mere proxy for China, but it also has its own independent cybersecurity apparatus that is fairly successful and aggressive, and it has its own local aims in the region, which should not be discounted. And we are seeing recently the ICBM test that came in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the nuclear deal discussions, and other developments. It's hard to believe that all of that is completely isolated. The other issue I'd like to point to and ask your opinion about is that some cynics believe that Obama administration and many of its operatives who followed into the Biden administration were not as concerned about the containing the nuclear power of Iran as they were in countering the GCC states by empowering Iran, which is why we've seen in both administrations a disbalanced policy of allowing Iran to gain ground um, at a cost to these countries and actually taking away capabilities from those countries over time. Obama froze weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. Biden is blocking them from missile purchases, which is why they went to China. We are seeing a very disbalanced politics in this respect, and doesn't make sense in terms of a cohesive nuclear policy. What's your take on these two issues?
I certainly see the claim that several analysts, I think, have made over the years about the more macro level approach the Obama administration took to Middle East policy, meaning that the engagement of Iran rather than the isolation of Iran would be in the US interest. And you kind of see that with the way the Obama administration projected transformational aspirations, not necessarily baked into the JCPOA, but framed around the JCPOA. And in many ways, the JCPOA makes most sense if you have those transformational aspirations about integrating Iran and not just changing Iranian behavior, but having a fundamentally different US-Iran relationship and regional relationship vis-a-vis Iran. It's not about countering Iran, but it's about enmeshing Iran. The Europeans really did put this language into print in some of their documents in 2016 and 2017, which I analyzed, and they used to have all these different creative acronyms, 3 C's, 4 C's, ever since the 90s, honestly, the Europeans have had kind of matching, and alliterative policies for their approach to Iran, which, talked about human rights, but only just talked about it, and then ultimately, and from a mercantilist perspective, try to deepen their ties with Iran. So this approach kind of trickled into the Obama administration's thinking. And ultimately, it wasn't about US-Iran trade or anything, but it was about revising the current balance of power. And in many ways, you could see the JCPOA and even the sunsets, the 10 to 15-year sunsets of the JCPOA. And even Obama saying perhaps in the year 13, the breakout time, the time Iran needs to produce fissile material for one nuclear weapon being 0, if Iran uses those advanced centrifuges, those machines that spin uranium at greater rates and purify the molecules. That in that 10 to 15-year timeline, you could see the Obama administration not directly saying this, but you could see them intonating that they harbored a different vision of what Iran may look like with 10 to 15 years of the JCPOA, with the increased trade, with the civil nuclear cooperation. And they may have thought that there would have been a revolution, which there were multiple iterations of protest. The Obama administration didn't actually actively support those, unfortunately. But ultimately, the regime, even under Trump, which retained a mass use of force against different iterations of nationalist protests, used weapons of war on their own population, even the regime put down those protests. There was speculation about Khamenei and Khamenei's health. Khamenei is the supreme leader of Iran. He's had this job now for over 3 decades. The regime is only 40 plus years old, but he's had this job since 1989. It doesn't look like he's intent to give it up anytime soon, even though he is in his early 80s. So there was, speculation Khamenei might die while the JCPOA is in force. You might get a different leader, different disposition. And then you had that mercantilist European belief that trade and enmeshment and engagement with Iran would moderate Iran's behavior over time. It's this philosophy of change. And ultimately, none of those things bore out. Not a single one of those things bore out. Yet the approach, under the guise of the Obama administration, was again resurrected by the Biden administration. And to the credit of the Biden administration, they don't harbor the transformational view of Iran. They're not looking to talk about 10 to 15-year timelines, because they can't even get 10 to 15-year timelines in negotiations. The Iranians are agreeing to 0 extensions of those sunsets. So if you believe what is being reported, which is that we have to pay more for a lesser deal, the reason is we're waiving the sanctions per the JCPOA. It looks like the US will be waiving some Trump era sanctions as well, including the IRGC designation, including the Supreme Leader Office designation, and some others, but getting less time on the clock, pretending as if the deal was enforced a full time. Next year, for instance, 2023, if this deal is unamended, the ballistic missile prohibition, which we talked about people not adequately enforcing at the UN level, that will lapse, meaning there is no broad multilateral international prohibition against Iranian ballistic missile testing. This is a strategic mistake. In 2025, for instance, the US will lose the ability through the mechanism of the Security Council to snap back or restore all of the tougher multilateral penalties on Iran that existed and give up its leverage, while the regime will be able to accrue more and more leverage through greater and greater investments in nuclear infrastructure and lapsing restrictions over a lesser period of time. So we have many of these trade-offs coming back, and they're coming back right at the fore. And the Biden administration is not calling them transformational because they're not. They see them as transactional, but they're framing this costly transaction as A, driven by a mistake of President Trump, and B, driven by the need to deal with those other threats, which, as you just articulated quite well, the administration sees in a stovepiped, narrow, and disconnected fashion. Now, I will be the first to tell you, as someone of a little bit more of a historical disposition, that Iran and Russia don't always see eye to eye. But increasingly, what you've seen in the Russia-Iran relationship, and particularly under the tenure of Supreme Leader Khamenei, as well as the ascendancy of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is that the regime doesn't mind being the junior partner to actors like Russia and China. Or even if they do mind, they believe it in the narrow regime interest rather than in the Iranian national interest. They're putting the Islamic Republic, not Iran, first, which means putting narrow elite Islamist ideology over broader populist nationalist public good in the country by bandwagoning with Russia and China, because that Venn diagram that you're talking about North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, the coordination among them, the biggest part of the overlap is that they harbor an anti-American disposition. And the more they coordinate, the greater that circle is going to move together to being one circle. And ultimately, they may be able to pose this potent axis against what some may say is a irresolute or potentially even declining American or Western liberal international world order. And that is something that those four actors all welcome, because they're looking to revise the regional balance of power in their neighborhoods, as well as stick it to the US, for lack of a better word, in as many domains as possible, which is why these nuclear negotiations have gone on for so long. Russia just tried to use it to get a sanctions-free carve-out to offset the cost of the Ukraine sanctions through potential Russo-Iranian trade. Literally, based on what the Foreign Minister Lavrov has said, apparently Washington has given such an assurance to Russia that the Ukraine sanctions would not affect Iran-related projects, which may include arms sales and definitely include civil nuclear cooperation between Russia and Iran. And I think only recently now we're seeing in Congress and in Washington and other places wake up to the idea that a fatally flawed in 2015 and fast expiring in 2022 lesser nuclear agreement that is midwifed by Putin's Russia, who is busy invading Ukraine, is not something that is moral, is not something that is good, and is certainly not something that is strategic, and is most definitely not something that is in the US national interest.
Now, it's interesting to see the contrast in reactions. Putin threatened, in the context of the current invasion of Ukraine, to use tactical nuclear weapons in the event NATO interferes in ways he deems unacceptable, and that was very vaguely defined, because we have seen a large transport of Stingers, Javelins, which did not trigger any nuclear threats, but then there was the discussion about the no-fly zone, which did potentially. But there's been, so he made a threat. We have seen no changes in the nuclear posture by Russia since those comments were made. And on the contrary, we saw one of his spokespeople today clarify that nuclear weapons would be used only in the event of an existential threat to Russia, which, no matter how much you spin it, is, would take a lot. But we have seen North Korea test an ICBM, a very realistic threat, with no particular engagement. And the reaction to that development has been exceedingly muted. How do you explain this? North Korea has been consistently testing their weapons, whereas Russia has been making largely empty threats.
North Korea, and in my work here at FAD, I also focus on functional issues in addition to Iran regionally. So, arms control, non-proliferation issues are global issues. They're functional in nature, and so they're region-free, or they're not necessarily region-specific. And looking at North Korea's missile program, again, the deep ties vis-a-vis Iran, the birthing many of the Iranian missile threats that we see today, all of that aside, looking at recent history in North Korean testing, there was a very muted response to the North Korean missile advancements of 2022. If you count cruise missiles, for instance, North Korea has tested over a dozen different missile systems, over a dozen different missiles of various types of systems this year. They're making advancement in hypersonic missiles. They're making advancement in long-range land attack cruise missiles, something that they had unveiled in September 2021, which would be a game changer because they're not covered by UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, which instead narrowly focus only on ballistic missiles. Side note, Iran has the same problem. The resolution, which is watered down and now time-specific, also only focuses on ballistic missiles, not cruise missiles. So there's a lot of legal loopholes here that need to be plugged up over time. But back to North Korea. The North Koreans have really done away with the self-imposed moratorium that came about after the two high-level Trump-era talks with Kim. And that high-level moratorium dealt with long-range missile testing and nuclear testing, because while it was in place, there was tons of rockets and shorter range systems, and even I think submarine launch systems tested by Kim. But in January, late January of this year, you had an IRBM, an intermediate range ballistic missile, fired in a lofted trajectory, tested by Kim. That was, I believe, a variant, or if not the same system that was tested in 2017. And that missile can reach Guam, can reach US territory. Whether it was the Hwasong 12, Hwasong 15, or Hwasong 17 that was tested more recently in this larger, more complete ICBM package that was also fired on a lofted trajectory and based on US government and other regional military sources, built off of several staged tests from February and March of this year. That weapon could allegedly strike, if not fired on that trajectory and taking advantage of several other atmospheric factors, could strike the continental United States. North Korea is also allegedly making advancements in re-entry vehicles, although we don't know if this most recent test had a significant RV advancement, whether towards MRVs or MIRVs, MIRVs, for instance. But ultimately, this is an evolving threat space, and the Biden administration has not paid attention to it. I fear the multiple calls for engagement and the two, I believe, January and March, if I'm not mistaken, smaller tranches of sanctions against North Korea only deal with the foreign procurement side. Basically, there were Russian cells in Russia, if I'm not mistaken, that procured missile and military-related equipment, and around East Asia as well for North Korea. I think it's high time that we dispense with this engagement approach. It's high time we dispense with only these, slap on the wrist kind of sanctions and resume maximum pressure on North Korea. And continue to put North Korea to a choice while also actively eroding gains it makes from illicit exports of coal, from oil smuggling and other illicit transfers, and from even money that could be repatriated from its diplomatic representatives abroad, and to really crack down on the King regime, lest we be confronted with more missile and military advancements.
Now, one of the issues that is not really currently being addressed very much is the fact that Iran's proxies, such as Hezbollah and Houthis, are not bound by the terms of the deal, and that includes nuclear weapons. Now, one might say that Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis are very far from developing nuclear weapons, and they're dependent on Iran for supply of whatever they do have, such as ballistic missiles, drones, and so forth. But let's look at it from a different angle. Not only are we seeing that China increasingly is getting involved in producing some of these weapons, such as drones for Houthis, but Hamas and Hezbollah have been in contact with North Korea over missiles issue and other issues. What's to stop them from at one point trying to produce a nuclear weapon or a tactical nuclear weapon with North Korea assistance? And what's to say that North Korea in turn is not using these intermediaries and these proxies to develop its own capabilities in various areas?
Well, it's an excellent question. There's a lot of theory and a couple of specific cases to bring up. One is, while North Korea may look like the hermit kingdom, the most sanctioned country in the world, may look like all of this stuff, it actually, and particularly in the past few decades, was a regional net military arms exporter. You know, the early Scud missiles that the Yemenis had came from North Korea, not from Iran. Iran later layered on other capabilities and technologies and equipment to improve upon some of those Scud systems and transferred whole systems or component parts of other systems. But North Korea is a military exporter. North Korea has had ties with some of those entities you mentioned. And to move it directly into the nuclear space, lest our audience forget, you know, let's not forget about the North Korean involvement in the Syrian nuclear program. The strike of the Israelis in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, at the Al-Kibar reactor in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. There's North Korean involvement there. We can't, you know, turn a blind eye to this. Somewhat similar to Russia, North Korea looks at some of these arms sales as transactional and in a mercantilist sense. And in a world where their partner, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is free from the international arms embargo, expect Iran to be more robust, not just in areas where it proliferates allegedly for free to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, or to other actors in what it calls the axis of resistance, but expect Iran to become a much lower tier, attempt to become a much lower tier arms exporter. Just recently, for instance, we saw the Iranians, particularly the individuals from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense and Armed Force Logistics, have a presence at a major regional international arms exhibit in Qatar at Dimdex. An arms exhibit that, if I'm not mistaken, didn't have a Russian booth this time, but had Turkey, had the US, had the UK, if I'm not mistaken. And in the past, Iran has violated UN Security Council resolutions for some of its military contractors tied to that same Ministry of Defense being present in Iraq at an arms exhibition called IQ-Dex, where either the US or the UK, depending on the year, were also present. So Iran has an interest. Look at Sub-Saharan Africa. Look certainly at Latin America and in particularly Venezuela for that mill-to-mill cooperation or the military sales. Iran may look to borrow from its partners, Russia and North Korea, from this more mercantilist approach to arms, rather than export the arms entirely for free or give the capabilities for certain lower tier systems like you saw with the more recent war in Gaza, where everybody in Gaza, whether it was Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, was singing the praises of the Quds Force, was singing the praises of the IRGC, and in particular, the slain former commander of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, for helping provide them with the domestic know-how and capability to locally produce rockets rather than have to smuggle them through many of these different circuitous routes. So there is certainly a there to the question that you raise. And I want to, again, take advantage of some of this historical depth to remind something for our audience. Yes, it's not very common to see these WMD cases from the state or the patron trickle down to a non-state actor or the proxy. It would be very, very, very dangerous and very, an entirely different risk aversion by Iran would have to be shown for this kind of stuff to happen. But the past couple of years should tell you that things can be revised. Iran has given ballistic missiles. Iran has given nuclear capable systems to its proxies. And to peel back not just the delivery vehicle, the missile, the drone, the cruise missile, the ballistic missile, the range, the payload, not just that, but the actual warhead, the potential fissile material, or the potential WMD material, let's look to a period of history. Because the regime swears that using WMD is anti-Islamic. They've manufactured this quote-unquote nuclear fatwa. But let's look at Iran's experience in practice, just as we need to look at North Korean arms proliferation in practice, rather than just say it's the Hermit Kingdom, it's sealed off, it's whatever. During the Iran-Iraq War, which is a bloody 8-year war, Iran fought against its neighbor, Saddam's Iraq, where it was invaded. And then after the first 2 years of the war, it brought the war onto Iraqi territory and continued it and failed at it for 6 years. Iran was somewhat isolated. But Iran during that period of time responded to Saddam's Iraq's increase and gross use of chemical weapons by developing its own chemical weapons program. And in fact, there are US intelligence documents from the CIA that talk about the Iranian chemical weapons program in the 80s. And then there are documents from the DIA that actually document the, albeit exceptionally limited, battlefield use of chemical weapons by Iran versus Iraq's much more larger battlefield use. And much more recently, I think in 2019 or 2020, the State Department had put out a report that also mentioned Iran's transfer of chemical weapons to Libya, which was a partner of Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. And Gaddafi's Libya had actually gifted Iran some of those Scud missiles that Iran initially fired at Saddam to respond to Saddam's ballistic missile attacks. And it is alleged in that document, that US government document, that Iran had transferred that WMD material, that chemical material, to Libya in the 80s for the war it was fighting with Chad. So you have evidence of WMD production, WMD battlefield use, and WMD transfer in the chemical department. And this is something missing from the debate about our discussion of risk tolerance, escalation dynamics, WMD use, WMD transfer on the nuclear side, because we do have a case for the chemical side, unless, of course, some in the audience may wish to disprove or somehow attempt to refute some of these US government sources which are declassified, and they may wish to do that academically, but then they would have to prove why. But nonetheless, I think this is an important and underutilized piece of information about the levels to which the regime has gone in the past in the WMD space and where it may go in the future. Because after all, when you transfer that to the nuclear realm and you look at things like the Atomic Archive, for instance, the treasure trove of documents the Israelis seized from the Iranians in 2018 and brought into the limelight increasingly. I even had the pleasure of doing a few translations of some of those bomb schematics through David Albright's Institute for Science and International Security, which did a lot of very rigorous analysis, technical analysis of some of those documents. And ultimately, there is proof there of signatures of military officials signing off on digging projects or tunneling projects. And ultimately, even more damning, there is proof that the regime was interested in developing a small arsenal in the early 2000s, before 2003. And they wanted to have up to, I think, 5 nuclear weapons. So the regime had an intent. It was working on developing a capability to match that intent. And you put all of this together, and it is one big picture for cause for concern.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because Iran, even prior to Islamic Revolution, the Shah did consider the pursuit of nuclear weapons, but was sidelined and eventually did not pursue that idea very rigorously. But that aspiration is not new. What's new is that the Islamic Republic is an aggressor, not just in the region but far outside of it, and for that reason there is additional cause for concern. Now, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things that you mentioned, one of which was the presence of the IRGC at various in various places that are considered either neutral or US allies, like Iraq and more recently in Qatar. And US continues to consider Baghdad a key ally, despite Baghdad was the only Arab country to be invited to Biden's Summit for Democracies in December, despite the fact that by all accounts it is largely controlled, willingly or unwillingly, by Tehran. Qatar was just designated a major NATO ally by the Biden administration, and both Republican and Democrat officials will claim that it is an essential ally in US defense operations in the region, in counterterrorism, and so on and so forth. But it is also under investigation by the Biden's administration's Justice Department for funding IRGC. And IRGC presence in Qatar is nothing new. The administration claimed that it was came as a big surprise to them. I personally don't believe this to be the case. So the question is, why are multiple US administrations willing to tolerate a level of cooperation between a quote unquote ally state and clearly adversarial forces? And the other issue is, on the contrary, Egypt, which is a long-standing US ally, has in the past tolerated a great degree of trade with both Iran and North Korea, even under President Sisi, and yet very recently joined Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain in a statement opposing the deal, opposing the lifting of sanctions on IRGC. What is behind that change in Egypt's security priorities?
Unfortunately, I'm not an Egypt expert, won't be able to adequately do justice to that question. But I do think the way Qatar has been behaving in the region, even after this alleged split in the GCC starting, in 2015 and then escalating really later on, there was some kind of a rapprochement between the GCC partners earlier, about a year ago. But I still think there is much more that lies beneath the water. Even prior to this GCC split, for instance, it was tough to do things in the region, just given some of the distrust between some of the partners there, not between the US and the partners, but between the local partners in the GCC, the entity members, when it came to things that was in the US interest and things that were certainly in their own interest, like integrated air and missile defense. But that was pre-2015 and pre-deal, and I certainly think the rising Iran prospect, which is a threat to all of them, could help pave the way for what I think would be a net asset for the region, which is that integrated air and missile defense. The challenge comes with a country like Qatar, for instance, when it hosts major U.S. facilities, hosts CENTCOM, but on the other side would give laissez-passer to this IRGC individual and the Ministry of Defense, which is sanctioned, and even sanctioned under European authorities, by the way, until 2023, to basically partake in this exhibit. I don't know about the extent to how Washington may have been shocked by this or not. It shouldn't be shocking when you look at the Ministry of Defense and its subsidiaries' participation in those older regional arms expos, like the one in Iraq, the IQDEX one. So it should not be surprising there. And it also shouldn't be surprising if you look at Iranian foreign and security policy, which has always been to try to divide out different members of the GCC. Because let's not forget that the GCC wasn't always the GCC, and the GCC has oscillated over time. For instance, during the Iran-Iraq War, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait were the hawks. UAE was not the hawk that it was perceived to be in the mid-2000s. Some might say, who take a more foreign policy, military kind of analysis, level of analysis, looking at Abu Dhabi, they might see the UAE as former Secretary Mattis said, as little Sparta, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was his quote back in 2010, 11, 12. But those who look at trade and economics and sustained Iranian sanctions busting operations and sustained Iranian trade on the other side through Dubai, may see the UAE as taking a fundamentally different position, a softer line towards Iran. And this is something to take into account when we had mentioned how Iran survived max pressure. It essentially amped up its non-oil-based regional trade. And the UAE, a major US partner, was one of the countries where Iran was able to accentuate this trade, as was Turkey, Malaysia, and several other countries that Iran has been able to dig into in the more recent era with its non-oil-based trade. So the GCC shifts its position on Iran when you look at it through a different lens, with the economic lens, military lens, security lens, political lens. And so there is great hesitation as to how effective could an integrated air and missile defense system for the entire region be if you have the entities behind the ballistic missile threat literally visiting Qatar, for instance, and depending on where you have the shooter, the sensor, the launcher, the interceptor, would one state actively pass on the information it collects to the other? There's all these different coordination problems. You could allegedly do what some missile defense folks have talked about, which is to try to build around some of this hesitation and phase in other states when there's time. But ultimately, I think the coordination problem is a problem that Iran has exploited in the past and is going to be keen on exploiting in the future. Something I do know a lot more about is a larger trend that Iran is looking to exploit, which is not between the GCC, but it's between the GCC and its patron or its supporter, the United States of America. In this sense, Iran's message in the different bilateral Saudi-Iranian diplomacy that has existed in 2021 is essentially that you can't build a regional order on excluding Iran and that you can't always rely on America. You know, Qasem Soleimani used to have a line that was quoted in relation to Iraq. I think it was first quoted in English in 2013 in the New Yorker by Dexter Filkins, if I'm not mistaken. And the translated line was that we're not like the Americans, we don't abandon our friends. And amid all of this regional escalation, something Iran has been trying to prove to the GCC, and sometimes sadly it is proven correct, is that the US may not always have their back in the way that they have perceived, even under a period of pressure. You know, the non-kinetic response to the downing of the US drone, the non-kinetic response to the cruise missile and drone strikes on US on major Saudi oil facilities, both of these in 2019. The most the US had done, if you followed press reporting about a few weeks after each strike, was that there was a major cyber attack allegedly from the US against the Iranians. There was no kinetic force for force. And if that's the kind of position that your adversary is going to draw an inference from about your resolve to stay with them, it explains this increased hedging by the GCC towards China. 2019 is also the year that it was unveiled that there was an increased interest in China, in Saudi Arabia, and having a solid propellant missile production capability inside Saudi Arabia built by China. Whereas in the past, the Saudis had actually purchased longer range systems from China. Now they're looking at how to produce some of them at home. And the person producing it or the entities producing it are not tied to their major Western partner, the US, they're tied to China. And these are trend lines that Tehran is hoping to accentuate. And it's part of how its larger strategy of trying to evict America from the region is going about, because they're trying to say to the anchors of the US presence and order in the region that they cannot rely on America. And in essence, Iran is hoping America midwives a pro-Iran order over time. And one way it will do that is with the JCPOA.
Now, the administration has tried to reassure some of its Middle Eastern allies during the Negev summit that just happened, that they are opposed to the nuclear Iran, that they will be working with all these participating countries to counteract Iran's threat. And indeed, what brought these countries together to begin with at that particular event is the realization that Iran is the #1 security threat for them in the region. Some of the countries are trying to balance their relationships with Israel with the trade and other relations with Iran for their own best interest and protection. The question is, how is it going to be possible for these countries, given this divergency, to cooperate among themselves? And second, can US really be of any assistance given their focus on the nuclear deal and on appeasing Iran, and given their opposition to the sales of defense systems to some of these countries and so forth? Missile defense systems, I should say.
Washington is really in a tight spot. I know you don't envy US policymakers these days, because to try to change the impression of your partner can sometimes be tougher than changing the impression of your adversary, particularly if there are certain sunk costs about disposition, resolve, personnel, party, anything. And we're not living in the Cold War in the sense that there's one arms producer or another arms producer. There are multiple arms producers. And so Washington should know. It doesn't mean that saying no is not okay. In fact, many times it's principle to say no, whether it's for a human rights concern or a strategic concern or a interoperability concern or reverse engineering concern or predation by great power concern. There's tons of reasons to say no to arms sales. But we should be cognizant of the consequences that also come with that, because those arms sales, those pillars of security, those sustained mill-to-mill ties is part of this larger relationship. It's not nefarious to say that. It's not It's not wrong to say that. It's simply an acknowledgement of the manner of the US partnership. This is the way in which this partnership has deepened over time. It was energy for security. These are long-standing pillars of how these states interact with each other. So when one side is perceived as not holding up the other end of the bargain, the pillars begin to shake. And it's in those periods of transition that other rising powers like Iran may try to take advantage of the lack of clarity or the lack of communication or the lack of intent to adequately address a problem. And in this sense, I think the myopic, and I'm using this word intentionally, over focus on the nuclear issue, the pretending that the bilateral discussions that the Saudis and the Iranians have are a way to midwife a new regional order or a way to bring about peace, or heaven forbid, the thing that's being reported now about the potential US willingness to swap removing its most powerful and stigmatic counterterrorism authority, the Foreign Terrorist Organization lifting, in potential exchange for a mere political promise by Iran not to engage in regional escalation. This makes zero strategic sense. And it's this kind of thing that drives your partner in the region to hedge. And it's this kind of thing that undermines the very message and the very intent of things like that Negev summit.
Is there a way for these contradictory goals to somehow be resolved? Can the administration do it? It sounds to me like it's trying to accomplish things that are in direct conflict with each other, obtain cheaper gas prices by way of OPEC while continuing to tacitly allow their enemies, such as the Houthis, to attack them. What is the thinking there? What is the administration actually hoping the outcome will be, and why do they believe they can get anything out of these countries the way they have positioned themselves?
I can't speak to the intent or the framing of the administration. I can only kind of respectfully critique what I see happening, which is, this degradation and downgrading and really distaste for domestic energy production here by the administration and its supporters, particularly on a certain flank of the left in America, for domestic energy production, despite what could come with that, which is energy independence and an entirely different national security discussion. But that, coupled with the fact that oil prices are global and it's a commodity, and not just you use it, but your partners benefit from it, while trying to go after Russian oil and then oddly turning a blind eye to strikes on oil facilities by a proxy of a country that you are trying to tempt into a bad nuclear deal to get some of their oil online, and then all of a sudden going back and reversing position in the Western Hemisphere. Literally, the US had recognized a different government in Venezuela just a few years ago. Now it is trying to get Venezuelan oil on the market. It's doing all of these very contradictory things. And I think the approach, with immense respect, I understand the predicaments that the administration is in, but I think this approach, this shunning of domestic production, this desire to cut off Russian energy, this turning a blind eye to Houthi strikes on energy infrastructure and energy in the region, this trying to bribe and buy off Tehran and bring more Iranian oil on the market, and this gross strategic and moral 180 on Venezuela, it simply doesn't make sense to me, and it is short-sighted and counterproductive.
Now, I'd like to kind of bring this to tie this whole discussion up with bringing us back to a point you mentioned earlier, which is the administration's attempts to pivot to a different set of threats, such as Russia, such as China, and so forth. To me, the signals that these countries have been getting from all of this is that, to some extent, no matter what they do, they'll be able to at least partially get away with it, because the Biden administration had to be pushed by NATO and by Zelensky and by others into increasing sanctions on Russia. They have essentially allowed Russia to operate with impunity in the hopes of gaining their assistance with the Iran deal. China is watching all of this. China is gaining no matter what ends up being the result in Ukraine. It's questionable that US has done what it could to limit China's influence. even direct threats, not to mention all their operations in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. What is the administration really pivoting to if they seem to be unable to address and conclude any particular threat? I am seeing a lot of jumping around, not a lot of consistent, calculated strategy to with any particular concrete objective.
I'm really glad you mentioned this because it does make the capping and pivoting approach. Try to end the war in Ukraine. Try to meet, match, and counter a rising China. Deal with North Korea. Cap the Iranian nuclear program. It does make this haphazard foreign policy approach of America sound a lot like musical chairs, where there's a lot of going around, but there's not an anchoring of the threats. We'll have to see more with some more foundational documents about a national security strategy. We'll have to really see the language that the administration uses to frame some of these threats. I, for one, think that the language should carry over about great power competition, about terrorism, about rank ordering these threats: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, non-state actors, violent non-state actors, terrorist groups, cyber. I think that's a healthy framework with which to look at the way we are dealing with the world in 2022. But it is unknown, actually, because it's not entirely isolationist. It's not entirely retrenching either. It's not entirely restraining or retaining either. There are elements of various strategies at play towards each of these countries, and it changes. You know, the U.S. shows impressive coordination and firepower, but as you mentioned, late in the game on the sanctions front vis-a-vis Russia, the U.S. has immense potential to, before it even goes about things unilaterally, to beef up multilateral sanctions, something that the administration has talked about wanting to do, multilateralism, acting by, with, and through partners on North Korea, but it's not doing that. Literally, after an ICBM test, there was a press release that talked about keeping the door open for diplomacy. If a major American adversary contests an ICBM and Washington offers diplomacy, what other sign does it send for other American adversaries to engage in other kinds of bad behavior? So there is great potential, but there is also a real contest for the soul of America, the kind of foreign policy that America wants to have, and the kind of risks America is willing to run in the world. And I think because none of those debates are adjudicated, and because the Biden administration, at least on the Iran file, when I talked about keeping the sanctions on the books but not enforcing them, has tried to have its cake and eat it too, the Biden administration is taking this half in, half out approach towards all those other threats that you and I mentioned. And it's leading to this unresolved or unfinished pivot or anchoring of its national security towards some of these other rising and if not ascendant challenges. And I think we will continue to suffer from that in the coming years.
Now, I'd like to conclude all of this with the final question about the US side of all of this. With Biden administration, I think it's pretty clear that for the next couple of years, until 2024 at least, they will probably be meandering somewhere among these approaches, depending on how other actors react, and trying to make the best of what the situation is, especially with possible political changes in Congress. We probably should expect more of the same. Among the potential Republican challengers to the leading senators and so forth, there's been pretty much consistency on energy issues, on Iran deal, on some of the human rights issues related to China. There hasn't, however, been a very clear approach about the role of US in the world. Are the future Republican challenges and the future leaders of Congress looking for to continue this isolationist trade, or to balance it with a more engaged approach? Are they looking to counter China in more specific ways beyond simply limiting China's domestic influence? What is the framework for confronting future and emerging threats beyond opposing whatever that Biden is doing?
You know,
what are you hearing from these circles?
I would point to, well, there's a couple things, and there's a couple hopes. Let me begin with two hopes, and then point to a document that could be instructive for the future, and then point to some concerns for the future. Two hopes. Hope number one, is that if there is a change, and this is not a partisan statement, but if there is a change, I have hopes too, if there's a Democratic administration, what the Democratic administration after 2025 could act like, whether it's Biden or someone else. Irrelevant because you only asked on the Republican side, but there are two hopes. One hope is, what's the best way to put this? That
The reason I asked about the Republicans, because my presumption is if Biden runs again, we could pretty much have.
There's a potential for the loss. Yeah.
Well, no. If he does run again, we can potentially predict a very consistent approach to what we're seeing now, more or less. That's why I didn't ask about that.
Maybe, or it might go worse. It might go on steroids. It might. There may be less cost to the restrainer mentality, and given that it would be I'm just kind of red teaming this. Given that there would be no cost to the Afghanistan withdrawal and no cost to the way they would handle Ukraine, obviously we'd have to see the way the midterms go. But in that sense, if Biden would win again or a Democrat would win again, you could see the kind of the cost-free path going, where look, we survived some of the greatest things that the Beltway blob, to borrow a phrase, was most concerned about, and therefore, why not accentuate this approach and, to borrow a phrase from Jake Sullivan, deliver a different foreign policy for the middle class. So it is possible that it could go in a different direction. But to the heart of your question, which was a political change, potentially Republicans, the two hopes. Hope number one is that, yes, there is consensus or seemingly consensus on the Iran file, almost exclusively defined by being anti-JCPOA and anti-whatever deal comes next. My hope number one, word of advice number one, would be being anti-JCPOA should be the price floor, not price ceiling of a potentially new Iran policy. And now is the time to study what worked, what didn't work, what lessons we need to learn, what risks are worth running, what risks are not worth running, thresholds for the use of force, getting authorities ready that the future president may need, making sure every tool in the toolbox is sharp, ready to be deployed, and having a maximum pressure policy that is maximum pressure ready on day one, that is not meted out and phased and incremental, because the administration, to their credit, did have a policy, but it was phased and it was incremental. I think we've learned that even though the administration had 4 years, it was really only a year and a half of maximum pressure. And in that year and a half, it had impressive economic dividends. It was able to unilaterally do what took over a decade multilaterally, and it had many in Washington and around the world thinking it was not possible. And not only was it was possible at record time, but give it more time to have an effect. So to have a counter-Iran policy in the region, to have a more coherent regional policy, to be able to marry functional and regional issues, geopolitics on one side, arms control, non-proliferation on the other, be able to bring in the human rights component as necessary, as needed, and where possible to effect real change in the region, not just have a one-way dialogue. And then ultimately, have the JCPOA issue be the basis for a larger Iran policy. Have an Iran policy, not an arms control policy. That's advice number one. Hope number two, advice number two, is to draw on what worked and what frameworks do work, and what I think is a healthy approach to not have the pendulum go isolationist, internationalist, and have the pendulum potentially break. Because I do see American domestic politics impacting its foreign policy much more directly than in years past. And this impact will have a greater impact in the future, given the politicization of a lot of these debates here in Washington. And that would mean to draw on things like the term principled realism. You want to be able to stand up for US values, US interests, in a principled fashion. You want to look at the world in a way that it is, not in a way that you may wish it to be. To understand that states are the most important actors, not the only actors, but they're the most important actors. And to take this principled realism framework that existed in some of the previous administration's strategic thinking and apply it based on successes and failures to the world of 2024 or 2025. So draw on what works and what frameworks work, and what frameworks don't tell you everything, but tell you a lot about what you need to know in a very little period of time. So that's hope number two. I believe I said I had a concern as well. Mm-hmm. And the concern would be, how can I put this? The concern would be that there is an ascendant wing. It's not what manifests itself today because, most Republican congresspersons are tough on Russia, and they are tough, particularly within the context of the Russian invasion and occupation and destruction of a lot of the Ukrainian cities that we're seeing live essentially on television. But in the future, to be able to understand in what theaters the U.S. should push and in what theaters the U.S. should give, and to have a very clear understanding of where the interest, the balance of values and interest lies. Russia, I think, is going to be a particular sticking point, given how political it got from 2017 to present for the Republican Party. So even though I'm not a Russia analyst, I would hope that they balance that values and interests framework well and are able to sustain it well moving into the future and not have it subside. I think that great power competition on revisionist state lens is very crucial, and I hope they end up retaining it and improving it where possible, rather than kind of giving into this siren song of walking away and thinking that the world is not as interconnected as it is and that we are insulated by the two oceans. Because I think 9/11 disproved that, and many more things will disprove that. And our friends and our partners in every region around the world, whether Eurasia, Middle East, Northeast Asia, Western Hemisphere, will be the bellwether to see that revisionism by these powers in action. So don't get too content. Revise the frameworks where needed. Base your policy on the reality of the threat and threats coming down the pike. But ultimately adopts a strategy of principled realism. I think that would be the best guiding star for a different administration.
I would hope that whoever is on the ascendance in that respect will heed your advice, because right now I have to say I have my own concerns about some of the discourse I'm hearing from DC on both sides of the aisle. It's not. Some of it is promising, but a lot of it is gravely concerning and uninformed, emotional,
I think you are
and
you
tribalist.
you are definitely right, and maybe there's a definitely cause for concern, but room for improvement for us, if you will. And forgive me, I don't know all your views well enough, but I'll say us based on what you said, because I think it's similar enough. Is that people who harbor a more internationalist view, like us, and believe that there's value in alliances, that this can be strategically sound and morally right at the same time, that things should be cost efficient. We have to explain to the grassroots more, and we have to explain to the grassroots better why some things are in the national security interest. These fears, these concerns, which may come even from dark corners, should not simply be poo-pooed. They should be engaged, because you don't want a bad root to be planted in a garden. You don't want the talking points to exist and codify and calcify about ending endless wars, or Putin is defending Christendom, or these
Right.
things that you do hear on both sides, but admittedly on this one, on one side more than the other, because I think it will have very negative, very toxic downstream effects. So areas I think that are room for improvement are when we talk about foreign policy, and I'm guilty of this, but it's a room for improvement, is to talk about strategy, not tactics. So if we're talking about sanctions, for instance, not the different penalties, but the value of having those different penalties on the target. To talk about cost. One reason the American public is dissatisfied with the American performance in the Middle East is the cost of America's performance in the Middle East. Not only not achieving victory, but the cost of not achieving victory, the human cost, the material cost, the reputational cost. To be more upfront about the costs of some of these things, and to make the case as to why the cost is, for point number one, in the interest. Point number three, I think, is law, both U.S. law and international law. I spoke about making sure the authorities are in place for whatever the U.S. needs to do, but to frame our arguments within U.S. law and within international law a bit better. I think that's a area of room for improvement. And lastly, consistency, consistent with the will of American people, and consistent with a vision of America that the founders have had or may have had. I think those are four areas the international side has room for improvement on. And that, I think, can stem what is increasingly an isolationist populist wave on both sides and help move more towards a stronger middle in this otherwise increasingly rancorous debate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate your points on this because this reframing of a constructive discussion, it's exactly the sort of cold shower I think many could use just to step back, take a look at the big picture and kind of zoom out from these granular and increasingly navel-gazing arguments that are not really helpful and aren't really resolving any of the issues at the end of the day. Well, this was a fantastic discussion. It raises a lot of questions, a lot of food for thought for sure. And I appreciate your participation and appreciate addressing these challenges in a meaningful and thoughtful way. Thank you so
Thank you
much
so
for
much.
joining.
Thank you.
This was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Next week, tune in at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, as usual, for our next upcoming episode. Thank you so much for joining.